Our sermon for this week is based on the texts Exodus 15, 1 through 21, and John 20, 19 through 31. Beloved community, earlier this week I visited the Islamic Center of Middle Georgia, where I was attending the monthly meeting for the month of April for the Women's Interfaith Alliance of Central Georgia. And the topic of that meeting was, what is the relationship between each of our faiths and creation, or between our faith and the natural world? And there was a Muslim woman at my table who lives in Centerville who was sharing about growing up hearing stories from both of her parents about the land that they grew up in and the places that they would go, and all of these vivid stories from their childhood that she knew so well, although she had never gone to that place. And after both of her parents had died, she decided to travel to that land and go to those places that she had heard of so many times in the stories of the lives of her parents. And she told us that she believes that the earth holds our memories, because she said when she went to those spaces, she felt so close to her parents. By those trees and those mountains and that water, and imagining her parents in that place, or those stories from her childhood unfolding in that place. She said it was sort of like she and creation were reminiscing together about the lives of her parents. And she said she felt so close to them, and she's gone back several times since. She felt so connected to that part of the earth because that's where her loved ones lived and grew in. And then on the other side of me at the table was a Hindu woman who lives in Warner Robins, who shared about many things. She shared about the stars and the mountains and the trees, but then she got onto the topic of air itself, to breath and air, and how breathing happens, and how when we breathe, we know that we are in the present moment, because breath, which is life, is always happening right now, in the moment of now. It's not something that is the past, it's not something that is the future, but every time we breathe, we are situated in the present moment. The breath of life is always happening right now. And I thought that was so powerful. And as I reflected on our texts for today, both of them include God's breath in that text. And these two very powerful stories from our faith tradition. We first have the story from Exodus, which is from a huge story of the Old Testament that's sort of a cornerstone to our understanding of the gospel message within the whole arc of the Bible, the story of the Exodus. And in that story, the people had gone through some stuff. They had endured some horrific, challenging things throughout their whole lives. And then they get to this moment where they've just crossed the sea on dry land. God has saved them. God has freed them from the people who were abusing them, from the people who were enslaving them, from the people who were harming them and oppressing them, leading them to salvation and life and freedom. And our text for today from Exodus 15 is the song that they sing when they get to the other side. The song led by Miriam and these other women with their tambourines. In this song of celebration, God's nostrils are talked about in it. A few weeks ago, I did a sermon where I talked a lot about the shape of human nostrils, and today we're talking about God's nostrils. The text describes it as the blast that went out from God's nostrils, God's breath that flowed, God's breath and God's wind are described in this song as powerful. They understood the breath of God, the wind of God, to be something that was active and powerful in the story of their salvation, in the story of their liberation, the powerful breath of God in their story, which led them to where they were, as they took breaths for the first time in the new life of liberation on that other side of the sea. As they tried to figure out what this all means, as they sang songs to make meaning, as they danced with tambourines to make meaning, to find meaning, to connect with their faith, all the while their own breath, which is the breath that comes from God, the life that comes from God, was accompanying them. And then we get to our story in the New Testament from John 20. Jesus has been crucified and is risen from the dead. Jesus is risen. Jesus is risen indeed. And our story for today, once again, has a lot of mixed emotions. Each Sunday after Easter, we typically read this gospel text every year, and it's a story of Jesus coming to the disciples when they are still in fear and shock, trying to figure out what this all means. And Jesus appears to them while they are hiding in fear behind locked doors. And sometimes people call this text the Doubting Thomas story. And I'm not going to focus so much on the Thomas part of this text for today. But throughout this story, you'll notice Jesus says the phrase, "Peace be with you," 3 times. At the very beginning of the text, Jesus says, "Peace be with you," as he appears to the disciples. Then the story continues a little, and Jesus once again says, "Peace be with you." And then when Jesus comes back to the disciples about a week later, when Thomas is finally with the other disciples, once again, Jesus says to them, "Peace be with you." And while Jesus is with the disciples, our text tells us that Jesus breathes on them. The seemingly small detail, once again, the breath of God is present after they've gone through some stuff. The breath of God is present as they're trying to make sense of what they have just experienced after they've endured some horrific things together. The breath of God comes to them as they are trying to make meaning, while still sort of frozen in their fear and their grief behind closed doors, not able to fully function. And Jesus finds a way to them, breathes on them, and then wishes them peace, that they may find peace as they are in the wake of something really hard and really painful, something that has been very bad and sad and scary and overwhelming, something really complicated. And there is good news there, but emotionally the disciples are not there yet, and Jesus gifts them his breath as a symbol that Jesus is indeed risen, still having breath after rising from the dead, which is a powerful gesture. Jesus shows them that he is risen as he breathes on them with the ability to breathe, to be alive. And also as the breath of God, that was present, blasting through God's nostrils, and this story of the Exodus that was an active, powerful participant in the story of liberation. Just as in the breath of God, within the very first stories from our Bible, in the book of Genesis, when the breath of God, the Ruach, the breath, wind, Spirit of God, in the beginning, the Ruach, the breath, wind, Spirit of God, hovered over the deep on those first days of creation, moving among all of those elements to create life, to create a world where God desires fullness of life for all. To design a world where God not only designs it, but God is fully invested in it. God is in relationship, in connection with God's creation. God gives love and connection. And from those first moments in the beginning of everything, all the way throughout time, right until our present moment as we breathe in and breathe out, situating ourselves in the now of our world, God has gone through all of the heavy stuff with us. God has gone through all of the hard stuff with us. God has gone through the joyous stuff with us. And through God's grace, we have been saved. God has been there working for our liberation and inviting us into that same collective work. And in these two stories that we remember today, the story from the Exodus, this song after they've crossed to the other side and they are in freedom, and this other story of in the wake of the crucifixion, while the disciples are still trying to make sense in their very raw grief. In these two stories, we remember how the breath of God is present with each and every one of the people in the stories. And then how the breath of God is present within each and every one of us. The breath of God is a gift from God's design of creation. It is a gift from the protection of our ozone layer, from our planet. It is a gift from our trees and the plants, from all of the interdependent ecosystem that allows us to be alive, to survive, to thrive, to breathe and live, even when we don't think about it, to breathe even when we're sleeping. But the breath that keeps us in the present moment, the here and the now, especially in those moments when we get really caught up and carried away by the past, especially in those moments when we get caught up and carried away by all of the what ifs, all of the catastrophic possibilities or unknowns of the future. God's powerful breath is with us to help us stay rooted in the here and now. Our texts for today show us God's breath in the here and now, roots us in God's powerful love, and paves a way for God's peace to calm us, to comfort us, to embrace us, to pass through every part of our being just as the breath of life does. It travels in our body, fills our lungs, and moves throughout our whole body, touching all of the parts inside of us. Our blood, which flows through our body, our muscles, our bones. The breath of life moves all through us. God's breath is a gift that we are given. And we can remember that the power of God's Spirit is in us. God's loving Spirit, God's peace-giving Spirit, even in the wake of the really hard stuff. Every time we breathe, may the Ruach, breath, wind, Spirit of God root us in the comfort and the peace and the power of the breath, of our breath, that is a gift from God, this gift of life from God that connects us to ourselves, that connects us to God, that connects us to our community, God's creation. And may our breath keep us rooted so that in our freedom that we have been given by God's grace, we may love our neighbors, so that we may listen well in our relationships, so that we may repair with compassion and care when we have done harm, so we may attend to our own needs so that we can be well and continue to join in the transforming work that God calls us to in our everyday lives. And at this time, I'll invite us into a breath prayer where I'll invite us to take some collective breaths together as I'll be repeating some phrases in the background as sort of a meditation form of prayer for us as we breathe. I'll invite us to inhale and exhale. Inhale the breath of God. Exhale grants us powerful peace. Inhale the breath of God. Exhale grants